Section 1. The Man Who Contains Multitudes. There is something strange about Rick Sanchez that lives deeper than his portal gun, deeper than the crackling green lightning of his technology, deeper than the belch that punctuates his genius with something deliberately unglamorous. It is something that exists in the quiet underneath all of that noise, in the pause between the joke and the moment that follows when the joke does not quite land because the truth it was hiding slips through anyway. If you have spent enough hours with this show, if you have let it run in the background of your evenings and your late nights long enough to get past the comedy and the action and the extraordinary visual imagination of it, you will have felt this thing. A strange, persistent, almost uncomfortable feeling. The feeling of watching someone who by all rights should not make sense, who by all philosophical rules of internal consistency should collapse under the weight of his own contradictions, and yet who makes the most perfect, devastating, completely coherent sense you have ever seen. Rick Sanchez is a walking contradiction, not a minor one, not the small, forgivable kind of contradiction where a person says one thing in the morning and does another by evening. Rick's contradictions are structural and deep. They are load-bearing elements. They are the architecture of who he is, and they run from the surface of his sarcasm all the way down to the bedrock of his grief, the grief he carries around as though it weighs nothing because he has made a decision, somewhere in the wreckage of his early life, that nothing weighs anything at all. He is a man who built an entire philosophy around the idea that meaning is an illusion, and then devoted his entire life to acting as though meaning is the only thing worth protecting. He is a man who claims to love nothing, and whose every action is a monument to how much he loves things, specific things, particular people, irreplaceable and non-negotiable moments that he would burn the multiverse down to protect. He is a man who is infinite in his power and utterly, hopelessly trapped in a cage of his own construction. That is what tonight is about. Every paradox. Every place where the internal logic of Rick Sanchez reaches its own edge and steps off it anyway. We are going to take them slowly, one at a time, in the way you read something that was written carefully and deserves careful reading. You do not rush these things. You let them unfold at the pace they were designed for. You let the ideas come and settle and open up into something larger than they first appeared. Rick C. 137. The Rickest Rick. The designation is not vanity. The show earns it. The Citadel of Ricks, that extraordinary interdimensional civilization built by and for versions of the same man across infinite dimensions, uses that phrase with genuine meaning. Among all the Ricks in the Central Finite Curve, the portion of the multiverse arranged so that Rick Sanchez is always the dominant intelligence. C-137 is the one they cannot categorize, cannot contain, cannot make behave according to the rules they built for themselves. He is the anomaly, inside a system of anomalies. The outlier among outliers. The thing the model cannot predict even though the model was built by the model. He was not always this. He was, once, just a man. Younger, with lighter hair, in a garage that smelled like ordinary oil and sawdust rather than the specific ozone and possibility smell of portal fluid. He had a wife named Diane. Her name in the show is spoken rarely and with a weight that makes every instance feel like a bell being struck in a large, quiet room. She had blonde hair and a way of existing in the same space as Rick that suggested she understood him in the specific, humbling way that some people understand difficult people, not by simplifying them, but by holding the complexity without flinching. They had a daughter named Beth. Rick built things for Beth that were somewhere between a father's extravagance and a scientist's compulsion, elaborate toys with logic built into them, structures that reflected how his mind worked, even when the mind in question was turned towards something as simple and profound as making his child happy. There was no grand agenda then. There was a garage and a family, and the particular domestic warmth that Rick would spend the rest of his life trying to reproduce, and the other part of his life trying to convince himself he did not need. He was a scientist who was, at that point in the show's backstory, still working toward the invention that would eventually define him. He had not yet built the portal gun. He had not yet seen what was on the other side of his own dimension. He was a man with an enormous mind and a small, sufficient world, and the world felt like enough. And then another version of him showed up at the door. Rick Prime, as the show later named him, was a version of Rick Sanchez who had already made the leap, who had already built the gun, who had already seen what was out there, who had traversed dimensions and encountered alien civilizations and built technology that laughed at physics. He came to see 137, not, it seems, out of genuine generosity, but out of something closer to arrogance. An instinct to offer the gift of his own experience to a lesser version of himself, to share the formula that changed everything, to extend the invitation into the larger world that lay beyond the garage walls. "Come with me," he said, in words or their equivalent. "Come with me and I will show you what you are capable of, what you can become when the limits of one dimension are no longer the limits of your life." And Rick C. 137 said no. He said no because Diane was in the house. He said no because Beth was sleeping upstairs. He said no because the warmth of that specific, ordinary, irreplaceable life was, in that moment, worth more to him than everything that was being offered. He made the most human choice imaginable, and he made it clearly, and he made it knowing at some level that he was giving something up. He chose love over the infinite. He chose the particular over the universal. He chose the small, bounded, impermanent life with the people he loved over the vast, illuminated, endless life of the man who sees everything. Then Rick Prime, insulted, perhaps genuinely surprised that any version of himself could make such a choice, sent a bomb through a portal and killed them both. Diane. Beth. Gone in a moment of violence, so casual in its execution that it borders on the surreal. The man who chose love over infinity had everything he chose love for removed from existence in an instant. And what grew out of the wreckage of that moment was the person the audience has been watching for years. Not the person Rick C. 137 was, and not the person he was offered the chance to become. Something new. Something that could only have been formed by that specific loss, in that specific order, with that specific combination of genius and grief as the raw material. The first paradox lives right here, at the very beginning, before the show's opening credits have even rolled for the first time. Rick became what he is, which is a man whose guiding philosophy holds that nothing matters and no meaning is real, precisely because something mattered so completely that losing it destroyed him. His nihilism was not arrived at through careful, dispassionate philosophical reasoning. It was not the product of quiet study and measured conclusion. It was a wound that healed wrong, the way bones sometimes do when they break in conditions where proper setting is not possible. The bone knits. The bone becomes solid again, but it knits in the wrong shape, and the wrong shape becomes permanent, and every step taken afterward is taken with a body that has accommodated the wrong shape for so long it has forgotten any other way to stand. Rick's nihilism is philosophical scar tissue. It exists to cover the place where the wound was. It provides a framework for existing in a universe that has demonstrated, in the most personal way possible, that it does not care about the things you care about. If nothing matters, then Diane's death matters less. If meaning is an illusion, then the meaning of what was lost is also illusory, and the loss is survivable. If the universe is indifferent, then its indifference is not a judgment on the specific choices Rick made, but simply the neutral operation of a system that has no opinion about any of its components. It is a brilliant solution to an unlivable problem. It is also completely insufficient, because the grief is still there. The grief never went anywhere. The grief simply got a philosophical framework built around it that was designed to make it look like something else, like intellectual clarity, like cosmic perspective, like the mature and appropriate response of someone who has seen too much to be sentimental. But underneath the framework, the grief is exactly what it always was. The specific, consuming, irreducible pain of a man who loved someone and lost her forever, in a universe that did not have the decency to be temporary about it. Rick built a portal gun. He taught himself to travel dimensions. He went looking for Rick Prime with the systematic patience of someone who had decided that revenge was the only project large enough to fill the space that Diane left behind. He went to war with alternate versions of himself who tried to stop him. He left blood across a staggering number of dimensions, and he did not look back. He helped found the Citadel of Ricks, that enormous experiment in Rick-on-Rick governance, and then abandoned it before it was finished because the Citadel was not the point. The point was Rick Prime. Everything else was a detour. Eventually he stopped, not because he found Rick Prime, not yet, but because the hunt had taken so long that he was old and tired, and the dimensions had blurred into each other, and he found himself in a dimension where a version of Beth had survived and grown up and had children. And there was something in the proximity to a family, even a family that was not originally his, that was close enough to survivable. He settled. He buried the dead version of himself who had belonged to that dimension. He became the grandfather of a boy named Morty, who had brainwaves that were useful for reasons of quantum camouflage, and he told himself that was why he stayed. He stayed because it was the closest thing left to home. All of this before the show begins. All of this underneath the comedy and the adventure and the science fiction of it. All of this is the ground on which every episode is built, the story that makes sense of every paradox, the reason the contradictions are not just interesting but devastating. He is the man who chose love. He is the man who lost everything because of that choice. He is the man who built a philosophy around the premise that love is a mistake, and who then spent decades proving by his own continued behavior that he has not stopped making it. Section 2. The Free Will Paradox. Here is a question Rick Sanchez has probably sat with in the dark more times than he would admit. Does he have free will? Does anyone? And, more specifically, in a universe where every possible choice that can be made is made somewhere, where every fork in the road is simultaneously taken by some version of you, where the multiverse does not waste decisions but runs all of them in parallel, without preference or hierarchy in that universe, what does it mean to choose anything? This is not an abstract question in the world of Rick and Morty. It has weight. It has teeth. Rick lives in a multiverse where the ontological status of choice is a practical matter rather than a philosophical one. He has visited alternate versions of himself who made different decisions at different junctions and ended up in radically different places. He has seen what happens when a Rick goes left instead of right, when a Rick says yes instead of no, when a Rick stays instead of leaving or leaves instead of staying. He has the receipts. He has the empirical data. The multiverse is, among other things, the largest possible data set on the question of what choices produce what outcomes when run across infinite iterations. And the data does not comfort. The data suggests, if you look at it honestly, that there is no choice you could make that would constitute a uniquely correct answer to any situation. There is always a version of you who made the opposite choice and survived it, or thrived with it, or found a different version of what you were looking for. There is always a parallel path, and the path is always occupied by someone who looks exactly like you and made exactly the opposite decision. If every possible choice is made somewhere, then what exactly is a choice? Is it a selection from a menu of options? Or is it simply the local experience of one branch of an infinite tree that was going to branch in all directions regardless of what you did? Is the feeling of deciding something the feeling of a genuine act of will? Or is it the feeling of a river finding the channel that was already carved for it? Rick knows all of this. He has thought about it more carefully than any human philosopher ever had the information to. And his response to it, which is the response of someone who has looked directly into the philosophical abyss and decided not to blink, is to treat free will as simultaneously meaningless and absolutely central to his identity. He dismisses the concept and exercises it constantly. He tells you choices do not matter, and then makes choices with the deliberateness and consequence of someone for whom every choice is the most important one he has ever made. The free will paradox has a very specific center in Rick's history. It is the moment he said no to Rick Prime. That no was a choice. It was one of the most consequential choices in the show's mythology, and it was made by a man who would later argue that choices are meaningless, with the full moral weight of a person who believed that some things were worth choosing even if the universe did not care about the choice. He chose Diane. He chose Beth. He chose the small, bounded life over the infinite, illuminated one. He chose with conviction and clarity, and the kind of certainty that only comes when you know, in the place beneath analysis, that you are choosing correctly. Then everything that came from that choice was taken away. And Rick's response to that loss was to build, around the wreckage, a philosophy that said choices do not matter, that the infinite multiverse makes every decision arbitrary, that the feeling of choosing is a cognitive illusion generated by a brain that needs to believe it is in control when in fact it is not. He turned the instrument of his own self-protection into a metaphysical argument. He said, "Choices do not matter because in some other dimension I made the other choice and got the other outcome. Therefore no choice can be held against me. Therefore the death of Diane is not a result of my choosing her, but of the universe's indifference. Therefore I bear no particular responsibility for any particular outcome." This is a very good argument. It is also completely undermined by his subsequent behavior, because Rick spent decades, literal decades, hunting Rick Prime for the specific act of dropping that bomb. He tracked him across the multiverse. He killed other Ricks who stood in his way. He endured extraordinary hardship and maintained an extraordinarily focused commitment to a single goal across an extraordinary span of time. This is not the behavior of a man who believes choices are arbitrary and outcomes are random. This is the behavior of a man who believes, with terrifying certainty, that what Rick Prime chose to do was wrong in a specific and irreversible way, that the choice had meaning, that the outcome was not just unfortunate but unjust, that something was owed for it. You cannot simultaneously hold that choices are meaningless and that justice for a specific choice must be pursued across decades. You cannot treat the multiverse as a philosophical argument against moral responsibility while also organizing your entire life around the moral responsibility of one specific person for one specific act. The positions are incompatible, and Rick holds them both, not through intellectual dishonesty but through the particular kind of emotional compartmentalization that happens when grief is sharp enough to cut through every theoretical framework you build around it. His grief is more honest than his philosophy. His grief knows that Diane's death mattered, that it was the result of a choice made by a specific person, that the specific person should be held accountable. His philosophy says none of that is real, and the grief wins, every time, because grief is older than philosophy and does not need to be consistent to be true. The free will paradox also operates in the direction of Rick's ongoing relationships. He uses the multiverse not just as a philosophical escape hatch from moral responsibility for the past, but as ongoing cover for the choices he makes in the present. If every version of him is making every possible choice in some dimension, then he can fail Morty here and tell himself that somewhere a version of him did not fail. He can be cruel to Beth in one moment and tell himself that in another dimension, a version of him was kind. He can refuse to say the thing that needs to be said and know that somewhere, another Rick said it. The infinite alternatives become a way of not having to commit to the specific, unrepeatable reality of this dimension, this moment, this relationship. But this is not how Rick actually lives. Rick lives with the consequences of his specific choices in this specific dimension. The Beth he hurt remembers being hurt. The Morty he scared did not get comforted by an alternate Rick. The relationships he damaged are damaged in the ways that matter, which are the ways that are actually happening here in the dimension where Rick and his family exist. The multiverse does not heal the wounds he inflicts. It just gives him somewhere to put the responsibility so he does not have to hold it. And yet he keeps living. He keeps making choices. He keeps being present in this dimension, with this family, even when the portal gun would allow him to be anywhere else at any time. The man who argues against the significance of free will exercises it constantly by staying, by coming back, by choosing, over and over again, without announcement or ceremony, to be here rather than anywhere else the multiverse offers. That is free will regardless of what Rick says about it. That is the most fundamental form of it. The choice to be present in a specific life, with specific people, over and over, in the face of infinite alternatives. Rick has all the alternatives. He visits them sometimes. He always comes home. He says free will is an illusion, but he lives as though it is the only thing he has. Section 3. The Love Paradox. Rick Sanchez will tell you that love is just chemistry. He has said it, or things close enough to it, across multiple episodes with multiple levels of practiced weariness. He will invoke the limbic system. He will mention dopamine and oxytocin and serotonin and the ventral tegmental area, will describe the neurochemical cascade of romantic attachment with the slightly contemptuous accuracy of a man who has memorized a magic trick's mechanics and finds the illusion unimpressive as a result. He will explain, in his particular register of exhausted precision, that the feeling humans call love is a biological mechanism, a trick the brain plays on itself to encourage pair bonding, which encourages reproduction, which ensures the continuation of the species, which is itself a process with no inherent value in a universe that will eventually heat death into indifferent silence. He is not wrong about the neuroscience. The brain chemistry of love is well established as anything that complex and poorly understood can be. The reward centers activate. The brain behaves, in significant ways, like it does in states of addiction. The person we love becomes something our neurology reaches for. But Rick is completely, catastrophically wrong about what any of that means. And his own life proves it with the kind of quiet, persistent, unassailable clarity that only happens when the evidence is not a theory but a person's actual behavior across decades of actual choices. Let us start at the center of it. Rick loved Diane. Not as a category, not as a neurochemical event he was unable to prevent. He loved her as a person, specifically and irreducibly, in the way that means the loss of her is not a loss of a type of thing, but a loss of one specific, unrepeatable, completely singular thing. We know this because of what happened after she was killed. If love were just chemistry, the chemistry would rebalance itself over time. Grief would fade as the neurological attachment weakened. Rick would be diminished, perhaps, for a period. But then the brain would recalibrate and the person would continue, and some functional equilibrium would be reached. This is how biology handles loss when the loss is purely biological. But what actually happened to Rick after Diane's death is not a story of recalibration. It is a story of crystallization. The grief did not fade. It hardened. It became the organizing principle of his existence, the thing around which everything else arranged itself. The portal gun he built was built for the hunt. The decades he spent traveling the multiverse were spent in the service of a revenge that was, at its most fundamental level, an act of love. Because you only pursue justice for something this relentlessly when that something mattered to you in the most complete and non-negotiable way. The hunt for Rick Prime was not rational by any cost-benefit analysis. It consumed his life. It cost him years he could not get back, and relationships he could not maintain while devoting himself to it, and a version of himself he might otherwise have become. He did it anyway. He did it for decades. That is not chemistry. Chemistry does not do that. Chemistry is a description of a mechanism. The mechanism says nothing about the meaning the mechanism produces. When Rick looks at what he felt for Diane and calls it limbic system activity, he is doing the equivalent of looking at a painting and describing the chemical composition of the pigments. The description is accurate and completely irrelevant to why the painting matters. And then there is Morty. Rick's relationship with Morty is where the love paradox operates at its most visible and its most heartbreaking, because it is where the gap between what Rick says and what Rick does is widest and most obvious. Rick says he keeps Morty around for the brainwave thing. The camouflage effect of Morty's neurological profile counterbalancing his own makes Rick less detectable to certain authorities and entities who would prefer to find him. This is true. The show confirms it. It is a real explanation. It is also about as adequate to explain the actual relationship between Rick and Morty as saying you wear a coat because of thermodynamics. Accurate. Beside the point. Think about the moments when the mask slips. Really think about them, the specific scenes, the specific instances when Rick's guard comes down far enough to let what is underneath show through. There is the scene where Rick, believing he is dying, turns toward Morty in his thoughts. The last thing before the end is not an equation or an escape plan. It is Morty. There are the moments in episodes where Morty is in genuine danger, and Rick's response has nothing measured about it, nothing calculated, nothing that suggests a man protecting a useful asset. It has the specific urgency of someone for whom the unacceptable outcome is not strategic loss but personal devastation. He has sacrificed himself for Morty. Not in the abstract, not in the way you sacrifice something you can afford to lose. In the way you sacrifice something when you believe the alternative is worse than the cost of the sacrifice. A man for whom love is just chemistry does not do that. A man for whom love is just chemistry protects what is useful and abandons what becomes a liability. Rick protects Morty in situations where abandonment would be the rational choice, and in doing so reveals every single time that the calculation he is running is not a rational one. The love paradox operates in the other direction too, and this is where it becomes most strange. Rick has the portal gun, he has the spaceship, he has the most advanced technology in the multiverse and the intelligence to use it to be anywhere he wants to be at any moment. He could be in dimensions that are more comfortable, more interesting, more rewarding than the one he is in. He has visited them. He has sampled the alternatives. He keeps coming back to this house, this family, this particular configuration of relationships that is objectively difficult and often painful and never uncomplicated. A man for whom love is just chemistry would eventually stop coming back. A man for whom love is just chemistry would find a new set of neurochemical triggers in a new dimension and settle somewhere quieter and more convenient. But Rick comes back to the noise and the difficulty. to the Beth who looks at him with the layered, complicated love of a daughter who was abandoned and returned to the Morty who carries the weight of the adventures in ways Rick cannot always afford to acknowledge, to the family that is messy and imperfect and his. He comes back because they are his, not in the sense that he owns them, in the sense that they are the people his love has made specifically his, and no other people in no other dimension are quite that particular thing. He comes back because love, whatever its neurological mechanism, produces something real and specific and non-transferable. Diane cannot be found in any other dimension. These particular versions of Beth and Morty and Summer cannot be replaced by their alternates. The specific texture of these specific relationships is not available anywhere else. Rick knows this. He knows it the way you know things that have shaped you more completely than any argument ever could. And he still calls it chemistry. He still rolls his eyes. He still builds the distance and the deflection and the elaborate philosophical architecture that is supposed to make the love look like something other than what it is. But the love is there. It is in every return. It is in the garage. It is in every moment of genuine, unguarded warmth that flashes through his armor before he covers it again with a joke or a drink or a strategic shift of subject. It is in the fact that he built an AI version of Diane in his old house in Dimension C-137, a version that called to him from another room, that he maintained even though, or perhaps because it hurt, because hearing something that sounded like her was better than the total silence of a world where she was completely gone. He built that because he loved her, not because of chemistry, because she was specific and irreplaceable, and the shape of his life without her was a shape he has never been able to accept as permanent. Rick says love is a chemical trick, but he lives like love is the only real thing he has ever encountered. And between those two positions, the living is the one that tells the truth. Section 4. The Nihilism Paradox. Let us look carefully at the word nihilism, because it is the one most often attached to Rick's worldview, and it is, by several important measures, inaccurate in ways that matter. Nihilism as a philosophical position is not simply sadness. It is not cynicism with pretensions. It is not the posture of someone who has been hurt and learned to perform not caring. True nihilism is something considerably colder than any of those, something more genuinely detached, something that has no preferences about outcomes because it has concluded, with logical completeness, that all outcomes are equivalent in their absence of meaning. A real nihilist does not pursue revenge. A real nihilist does not hold grudges. A real nihilist does not experience the kind of consuming, organized, decades-long grief that organized Rick's life after Diane's death. Because organized grief requires an architecture of meaning that genuine nihilism has dismantled. Rick Sanchez is not a nihilist. He is a person who performs nihilism with enormous skill, because the performance provides the only psychological shelter available to someone whose emotional reality is so large and so painful that the alternative to the performance is simply being unable to function. Dan Harmon, who helped create the show, has described Rick as the seam between God and man. The image is precise. Rick has the cognitive reach of something divine and the emotional vulnerability of something thoroughly human. The problem with this combination is that the divine perspective, the view from a sufficient distance and with sufficient information, does tend to dissolve the comfortable fictions that make ordinary human life bearable. It tends to reveal the contingency of meaning, to show you that the structures humans build to give life significance, the religious frameworks, the social narratives, the stories about specialness and destiny and inherent value, are constructions. They are things that were made. They were made carefully and they serve genuine purposes, but they are not engraved in the nature of the universe. They are human responses to a universe that would not generate them on its own. Most people never see this clearly enough to be destabilized by it. Most people live inside the constructions without awareness of the constructions, which is the condition that makes the constructions work. The warmth of a shared story requires some degree of not noticing that it is a shared story rather than a simple fact. But Rick notices. He has always noticed. His intelligence makes it impossible for him not to notice. And once you have seen the scaffolding clearly enough, you cannot simply choose to not see it again. You have to find a way to live with the knowledge, and that finding is not guaranteed to go well. Rick's solution was to declare the constructions worthless. If meaning is constructed rather than inherent, then meaning is not real. If love is neurochemistry rather than cosmic truth, then love is not real. If every choice exists alongside infinite alternative versions of itself, then no choice is uniquely meaningful. He followed the logic of disillusionment all the way to its most extreme conclusion, which is that nothing is worth defending, nothing is worth pursuing, nothing is worth caring about, because caring is itself part of the illusion that the intelligence should have dismantled. This is where the nihilism paradox enters, because Rick does not live this conclusion. He lives the opposite of it every single day in ways too consistent and too specific to be accidental. He fights constantly with the energy and commitment of someone who has enormous amounts of skin in enormous numbers of games. He fought Rick Prime for decades. He fights for his family when they are in danger, not with the measured response of a strategist protecting assets, but with the raw, reflexive ferocity of someone who cannot tolerate the alternative. He fights against authority he considers corrupt, not with detached efficiency, but with the particular intensity of someone who takes the corruption personally. He fights for Morty in ways that cost him things a true nihilist would never spend, because a true nihilist has nothing he cares enough about to spend. A genuine nihilist does not fight. Fighting requires stakes. Stakes require caring. Caring requires a value structure that genuine nihilism has abolished. The fact that Rick fights, constantly and personally, and with enormous emotional investment in the outcomes, is the clearest possible evidence that his stated philosophy has nothing to do with how he actually operates. He also does kind things. Not consistently, not without lapses that sometimes constitute genuine moral failure, but regularly and in ways that cost him something. He saves the homeless man inside whom he builds Anatomy Park, because something in him responds to vulnerability with an impulse that has nothing nihilistic about it. He goes back for Morty. He builds the portal gun not just as a tool for adventure, but as something he uses, repeatedly and at cost, to protect the people he cares about. A man who believed in nothing would have no occasion for kindness, because kindness is an investment in the experience of another person, and you only make investments when you believe the thing you are investing in has value. Rick believes his people have value. This is what the nihilism paradox comes down to. Not that he says one thing and does another through weakness or inconsistency, but that the thing he says and the thing he does reflect two entirely different, entirely genuine aspects of his psychology. The thing he says is the protective layer. The philosophy of meaninglessness is the carapace. It evolved in response to a specific kind of predation, which is the predation of a universe that can take the things you love and make sure they cannot be recovered. If nothing means anything, then loss cannot hit the deepest place. If there is no deepest place, the deepest wounds cannot land. The thing he does is what is underneath the carapace. Underneath it is a man who cares so much that the caring scares him, who loves so specifically that the specificity frightens him, who is invested in the outcomes of his relationships so deeply that he cannot afford to admit the depth, because admitting it would mean acknowledging how much he has to lose, and he has already lost things he cannot get back. Rick told Beth something once that is more honest than almost anything else he has ever said. He told her that when you know nothing matters, the universe is yours, but that the universe is basically an animal, that it grazes on the ordinary, that it creates infinite idiots just to eat them, that smart people get a chance to climb on top and take reality for a ride, but it will never stop trying to throw you, and eventually it will. That speech is not nihilism. That speech is the most precise description of tragedy I have encountered in animated television. It is the voice of someone who has looked at the universe clearly, who has not blinked, who does not lie to himself about what he sees, and who finds what he sees not liberating but devastating. That is not what nihilism sounds like. Nihilism does not sound devastated. Nihilism does not feel the loss it is pointing at. Nihilism is beyond devastation. Rick is thoroughly inside it. He is not a nihilist. He is a man who wanted to become one and did not quite manage it, because the love was already too deep, and the grief was already too specific, and the investment in the lives of particular people was already too complete to be dissolved by any philosophy, no matter how carefully constructed. Section 5. The Control Paradox. Rick Sanchez controls everything. This is the show's premise. It is what makes him the most dangerous being in the multiverse. He controls movement through reality. He controls the flow of information, determining what people know and when and in what form. He controls narrative, which is to say he controls how situations are framed, how outcomes are understood, how the meaning of events is distributed among the people experiencing them. He controls exit. He is, perhaps more than anything else, a man who always has an exit, who can never be cornered because he can always open a portal and step through it, who has made it structurally impossible for anyone or anything to trap him. And yet Rick is one of the most thoroughly trapped characters in contemporary television. The control paradox is perhaps the most quietly devastating of all the paradoxes, because it is the one where the very source of Rick's freedom is also the substance of his prison. His intelligence is the key that opens every lock and the mechanism that keeps rebuilding the locks. He is smarter than every adversary he faces, and smarter than the situation he finds himself in, and smarter than any solution anyone else proposes. And this intelligence that is supposed to be liberating is also, to an extraordinary degree, the thing that keeps him from being free in the only way that would actually matter to him. Dr. Wong said it, calmly and directly, in the way that good therapists say devastating things, which is without drama, without accusation, without the performance of insight that would allow the recipient to dismiss it as theater. She told Rick that his genius allows him to avoid doing the simple, boring, hard, necessary work of being a person. She told him that intelligence and the sickness destroying his family are connected not in the way he thinks, where intelligence is the solution and the sickness is a separate problem, but in a more intimate and more troubling way. Everyone in his family uses intelligence to justify sickness. Intelligence becomes the permission structure for avoidance. Because if you are smart enough, you can always construct a reason why the hard thing is not necessary right now, why the vulnerable moment can be deferred, why the work of genuine connection is something you can get to later. Rick transformed himself into a pickle to avoid family therapy. This sentence is one of the most absurd sentences in the English language, and one of the most accurate descriptions of a specific kind of psychological pattern available in fiction. He performed an extraordinarily complex biological transformation. He engineered a recovery mechanism. He survived an action movie inside a foreign intelligence building that required rat exoskeleton engineering and improvised weapons manufacturing. He did all of this to avoid an hour of conversation with a therapist. The energy required to avoid the vulnerable thing was thousands of times greater than the energy required to simply do the vulnerable thing. And he spent it without apparent hesitation, because the vulnerable thing was more frightening than the action movie, because the vulnerable thing was the real danger. The control paradox is that the more power Rick has to shape his external reality, the less able he is to change his internal one. He can rewrite the genetic code of a planet. He cannot make himself say what he needs to say to the people who need to hear it. He can break out of a Galactic Federation maximum security prison. He cannot stay in a therapy session without engineering an elaborate escape. He can build technology that circumvents the laws of physics. He cannot circumvent the specific, durable architecture of his own grief and fear. This is not a simple irony. It is not the kind of observation that can be made lightly and moved on from. It goes very deep into what it means to be the person Rick is. Intelligence, at the level Rick operates it, produces a specific problem. It makes you very good at seeing problems, and very good at solving problems, and therefore very attuned to the problems in yourself that you cannot solve. A person of average intelligence can overlook their own psychological patterns because the patterns require a certain amount of observational precision to detect. But Rick cannot overlook anything. He sees the patterns with perfect clarity. He understands, in exact terms, why he does what he does and what it costs him and what it would take to change. He has the insight that therapy is supposed to produce, ready-made, without the work, and the insight without the work is, it turns out, essentially useless. Knowing why you do something damaging and not being able to stop doing it is not enlightenment. It is a particularly sophisticated form of suffering. Rick is trapped in a prison he has the blueprints for. He knows every wall, he knows every mechanism, he knows, with the precision of a man who has mapped his own psychology, the way he maps alien planets, exactly what keeps him confined, and exactly what it would take to get out. And he cannot get out. Not because the doors are locked, because getting out would require the one thing that is beyond his control, which is choosing, consistently and persistently, and without the escape hatch of the portal gun or the next adventure, to stay in the room with what is painful and let it change him. There is something specific that keeps Rick in the prison, not his intelligence which would help him escape it. Something older and more foundational, the belief that he deserves it. That the prison is the appropriate consequence of the person he became after Diane died. That the distance and the self-destruction and the inability to let people fully in is not just a wound that needs healing but a sentence that should be served. Because if Rick let the walls down, if he allowed himself to be fully present and fully invested in these people, he would be making himself vulnerable to the specific kind of loss that already destroyed him once. And the only way to protect against that loss is to never arrive fully enough that losing would be catastrophic. This is the deepest and saddest form of the control paradox. Rick controls his external reality so thoroughly, partly to compensate for, and partly to distract from, the one thing he cannot control, which is how much he cares. He cannot turn the caring off. He has tried. The philosophy of meaninglessness was an attempt. It did not work. So he controls everything around it instead, keeps everything in motion, keeps the adventures coming, keeps the exits open, keeps the speed high enough that the underlying weight of the caring cannot quite catch up. It always catches up. In the quiet moments it catches up. In the moments between adventures. In the moments when Morty is asleep and the garage is quiet and the portal gun is in its holster and there is nothing to do and nowhere to be, and the present moment is just the present moment, unadorned and inescapable. In those moments, the man who controls everything is left alone with the one thing he has never been able to get a handle on. Section 6. The Morty Paradox. Morty Smith exists in the show's founding logic for a specific, practical, expressly stated reason. Rick's genius generates a brainwave pattern that certain entities would very much like to track. Morty's neurology, by some convergence of biological coincidence, and probably Rick's selection of him specifically, counterbalances Rick's signal in a way that makes Rick invisible to certain kinds of detection. The technical explanation is offered early and confirmed by the show's subsequent lore. Rick needs a companion with Morty's profile, the way a signal needs noise to obscure it. The companion is a tool. The relationship is functional. This explanation accounts for approximately 0% of what Rick and Morty actually mean to each other. The Morty paradox is this. Rick chose a companion to help him hide, and in doing so found the one person in the universe who sees him most clearly. He brought Morty along for reasons of concealment, and Morty has, through the accumulation of years and shared extremity and genuine, stubborn, unkillable affection, become the primary context in which Rick has nothing to hide from. Morty knows things about Rick that Rick does not let anyone else know. Not because Rick chose to reveal them, but because the adventures produce knowledge that cannot be controlled. Morty has seen Rick at his most frightened, at his most desperate, at his most broken, when the intelligence fails and the armor cracks and what is underneath is just a man who is scared and tired and has no plan. Morty has sat with those moments and has not left. Rick brought Morty along to be camouflage. Morty became a witness. And what he witnesses over and over is the person underneath the performance. The tool Rick chose for concealment has become the person Rick is most visible to, and the visibility is so complete that it is, in its own way, a form of intimacy Rick has not managed with anyone else in the current span of his life. There is a second dimension to the Morty paradox that is worth sitting with. Rick's relationship with Morty is simultaneously his most authentic, and the one in which he behaves most carelessly. He is most genuinely himself around Morty. The guard comes down furthest. The real feelings surface most readily. The person Rick actually is, as opposed to the person he performs, is most present in Morty's company. And he is also, in Morty's company, most likely to be careless with someone's feelings, most likely to use someone as instrumental to his own purposes, most likely to take the relationship for granted on the assumption that it will survive the taking for granted. This is not a paradox unique to Rick. It is one of the most human things about him, and one of the most uncomfortable things about human relationships generally. We tend to treat most carefully the relationships where we feel most precarious, where the other person has the power to leave, and we tend to treat with less deliberate care the relationships where we have decided, somewhere below consciousness, that the person will stay regardless. Rick has decided Morty will stay. He has decided it in the specific way of someone who needs it to be true, and has therefore made it a premise rather than a possibility. And this decision frees him to be more honestly himself, while also allowing him to be more honestly careless. The authenticity and the carelessness are two faces of the same coin. Morty is also, paradoxically, the thing that keeps Rick from fully becoming the thing Rick's circumstances would otherwise produce. Everything Rick has been through, the loss of Diane, The decades of war with alternate selves, the construction of the Citadel and the contempt he developed for it, the settling into a dimension that was not originally his, the long accumulation of violence and loss and moral compromise that comes with living the life Rick lives, all of that pushes toward a specific kind of outcome. It pushes toward the version of Rick that is just cold, just done, just fully convinced that connection is not worth its cost, and that the appropriate response to a universe this indifferent is to become similarly indifferent. Morty prevents that. Not consciously, not through argument, not even through persistent moral instruction, just through being present and being affected and being stubbornly and against all the available evidence, still capable of caring about what happens and still capable of being hurt by it. Every time Morty is genuinely horrified by something, every time Morty refuses to normalize the thing that should not be normalized, every time Morty pushes back or breaks down or insists on treating something as serious that Rick would prefer to treat as trivial, Rick is forced into contact with the fact that someone is still affected, that the universe still produces people who respond to it with something other than armor. And Rick responds to that. Across seasons of the show, across years of watching Rick interact with Morty, one of the most consistent patterns is that Rick does, in small and often deniable ways, adjust himself in the presence of Morty's reaction. Not always. Not dramatically. Not in ways that suggest a clean moral arc toward improvement. But in the way a large stone is gradually changed by water, slowly in the direction of the water's persistent pressure. Morty's presence applies a persistent pressure on Rick in the direction of caring, and caring, though Rick will never admit it, is the direction Rick wants to go. He chose Morty to hide. He found, in Morty, the one situation where hiding is not quite possible. The tool became the context, the camouflage became the relationship, and the relationship has become quietly and without ceremony one of the defining features of who Rick Sanchez is. Section 7, The Memory and Identity Paradox. Here is a question that sounds abstract until you hold it close enough that it stops being abstract. If you wake up in a new body, in a new dimension, living a life that was not originally yours, having stepped into it through the death of the version of yourself who belonged there, are you still you? Rick C. 137 has grappled with this question in the most concrete possible terms. He has died and been rerouted through Operation Phoenix, the multiversal consciousness transfer system he developed as a contingency against his own mortality, into clone bodies in alternate dimensions. He woke up in dimensions where the ambient Rick was a fascist, or an insectoid creature, or some other configuration of genius that the universe had arrived at by a different route. He has lived in a dimension that was not originally his, the one where the previous occupant, Rick C. 131, died in a lab accident, and where C-137 stepped in and buried the predecessor and became the Rick of a family that was not his original family, but which became, through the only mechanism that actually makes something yours, the mechanism of living in it, his. He has carried his memories through all of this, the memories of Diane and young Beth, the memories of the choice he made and what it cost, the memories of the decades of hunting, the memories of the Citadel and his abandonment of it. He carries all of it wherever he goes, because the mind that transfers carries its full history. The identity persists through the memory, the way a river persists through the geography it has carved. But here is where the paradox becomes uncomfortable and precise. Rick's memories belong to C-137. The experiences he is currently having, the ongoing ones, the daily ones, the ones accumulating right now in the dimension he chose to settle in, belong to the body and the life of that dimension. He remembers a Diane who was killed in his original garage. He is living with a Beth who was not killed, who grew up, who made the compromised and complicated choices of someone who grew up without her father, and with the shape of that absence informing everything. He remembers the daughter he lost. He is living with a daughter who is real and present and his, or is she? The show never resolves this, and it is right not to, because neither resolution is honest. To say she is not his daughter would be to erase a decade of genuine, complex, real relationship that exists between them, a relationship that has cost both of them something and produced something neither of them could have alone. But to say she is simply and unqualifiedly his daughter, without the strangeness of how he came to her, is to paper over the aspect of their relationship that is built on something other than original continuity. He came to her from outside. He is not the Rick who left when she was a child. He is a Rick who chose to stay, having come from somewhere else, and the choosing to stay has made him in some meaningful sense hers. But there is still the question, the one neither of them probably articulates but that both of them probably feel, of what she is to him and what he is to her, and whether the words they use for those things are quite right. Identity is not a fixed object. It is a process. It is the ongoing negotiation between the memories you carry and the experiences you are currently having, between who you were and who the present is making you. For most people, this negotiation happens slowly, over a lifetime, with a recognizable continuity of body and circumstance that gives the negotiation a stable ground to happen on. For Rick, the ground shifts. The body changes, the dimension changes, the family, technically, changes. And the negotiation that is his identity has to happen on moving ground, without the stability of physical continuity, held together only by the thread of memory and the will to maintain the specific self those memories constitute. This is why the reveal that Rick's memories might be partially constructed, partially performed, is so important to the show's mythology. Rick told a story about his own past in Season 3 that he later claimed was fabricated. It turns out to have contained the essential truth wrapped inside the performance. But even real memories are not objective records. They are reconstructions, rebuilt every time they are accessed, shaped by the emotional state of the person accessing them, by what they need the past to have been in order to make sense of who they are now. Rick's memories of Diane are mediated by decades of grief and decades of the armor that grief built. The Diane he remembers may be more real than any description could capture, and also shaped by the specific weight of what happened to her. Memory is not a photograph. It is a painting, revised every time you look at it. The identity paradox is that Rick insists on a specific, bounded, precisely identified self, C-137, the Rickest Rick, the one who chose Diane, whose path through the multiverse was defined by that choice and its catastrophic consequence, and this insistence is both his most important truth and his most complicated fiction. It is his most important truth because it is the genuine account of what shaped him and why he is who he is. It is his most complicated fiction because the person who made that original choice and the person living in this dimension right now are connected by memory and severed by experience in ways that make a simple line between them impossible to draw. He is C-137 and he is whoever he has become. He is the man who chose Diane and the man who has been choosing every day since to stay in a life that is a shadow of the one he chose. He is the specific and irreplaceable Rick who exists at the intersection of all the things that happened to him, and he is also, in some fundamental way, still being made, still accumulating, still becoming. Section 8. The Mortality Paradox. He should be comfortable with death. He has seen it in more forms than can be catalogued. He has caused it, in dimensions too numerous to track, with varying degrees of intention and a variable amount of what the show allows us to call remorse. He has encountered mortality as a practical reality on such a regular basis that it has the character of a familiar landscape, something he moves through rather than something that stops him. And yet he is haunted, not in the general way, not by the concept or the abstraction. He is haunted by something specific and irreplaceable. He is haunted by Diane in the particular, consuming way that only happens when the haunting is not just grief, but the particular grief of permanent impossibility. The mortality paradox requires understanding what Rick Prime did with the Omega device. It is not enough to say that he killed Diane. What Rick Prime did was more deliberate and more complete. He used the Omega device, a weapon designed to erase not just an individual, but the individual's existence across all dimensions, to remove Diane Sanchez from the multiverse entirely. Not to kill her in C-137 and leave her alive in other dimensions. To eliminate the possibility of her existence anywhere. This meant that Rick C-137, who lives in a universe of infinite alternatives where the death of one version of someone you love is at least theoretically survivable because the someone still exists elsewhere, was denied the consolation that the multiverse would otherwise offer. He cannot find a dimension where Diane is alive. There is no parallel universe to step into where the morning is better. The Omega device did not just take Diane. It took the theoretical possibility of Diane. It made grief permanent in a universe where permanence is almost mythological. This is what Rick carries. Not just loss, but the specific, engineered impossibility of recovery. Most losses in a multiverse can be, if not reversed, at least paralleled. There is usually a version somewhere that is still intact. But Rick Prime understood, with the cold precision that is the defining characteristic of someone who knows their target from the inside, that the way to wound C-137 most completely was not just to kill the person he loved, but to make sure she could not be found again. Not anywhere. Not in any frequency of reality. Nowhere. The mortality paradox, then, is this. Rick is the character in the show who is most sophisticated about death. He has arranged for his own to be reversible. He has built the technology to outlast his own body, to transfer his consciousness, to continue beyond what would stop anyone else. He is, in a very real sense, functionally immortal. And he is also the character most thoroughly destroyed by a death that cannot be reversed. The man who solved mortality is the man most completely undone by a mortality that admitted no solution. The man who has made death into a manageable problem is the man most consumed by the one death that was specifically designed to be unmanageable. This paradox illuminates everything about how Rick relates to the living people around him. The distance he keeps, the carelessness he sometimes shows, the way he holds people close enough to matter but not quite close enough to be catastrophic to lose. All of this is shaped by the specific, irreversible nature of what happened to Diane. He knows, at the deepest level that knowledge can reach, that loss can be permanent. He knows that the multiverse does not guarantee alternatives. He knows that someone can be taken from you in a way that forecloses every door, and so he hedges. He keeps the portfolio diversified. He loves without quite committing to the full weight of love, because the full weight of love is what he cannot afford to put down again. Because when he put it down before, the universe found a way to make sure he could never pick it back up. The man who cheated death more cleverly than anyone is the man most haunted by it. Section 9. The Evil Paradox. Is Rick Sanchez evil? The question is worth asking slowly, worth turning over carefully and looking at from multiple angles before landing anywhere. The show wants this. It was designed for the discomfort of the question rather than the resolution of it, because the resolution is not the interesting part. The case for Rick being evil is not thin. He has caused deaths across a staggering number of dimensions, with varying degrees of intention. He enslaved an entire civilization within a miniaturized universe to power his car battery, a detail the show delivers with comic timing that almost but not quite obscures its genuine horror. He abandoned his daughter, the original Beth, for 20 years, during a period in her life when a parent's presence was the most foundational thing. He has sold weapons to entities he knew would use them for violence. He has treated people in his immediate family with a cruelty that is too precise to be accidental, that has the surgical quality of someone who knows exactly where the tender places are. He has, by his own admission, caused harm on scales that most fictional villains would consider ambitious. These things are true. They are not ambiguous. They are part of who Rick is. And yet, Rick is also the character in the show who is most consistently and most accurately honest about the actual nature of power, authority, and institutional behavior. He treats every government, every organization, every official structure of authority he encounters with contempt, and he does so in a universe where every such structure, without exception, turns out, upon examination, to be corrupt, self-serving, and contemptuous of the well-being of individuals. The Galactic Federation, the Citadel of Ricks, the various ruling bodies and governing institutions the show has examined, are all, when the show gets close enough to look at them clearly, rotten in the ways Rick said they were. His contempt is not the paranoia of a broken man. It is accurate assessment based on available evidence. He is also the character who most consistently tells uncomfortable truths, even when comfortable lies are available and would cause less immediate pain. He is not kind about it, frequently, but he is honest. And in a universe crowded with comfortable fictions, with stories people tell themselves to make the situation bearable, Rick's insistence on the uncomfortable truth has its own form of integrity. He shows Morty the grave they dug for themselves, their own dead bodies in someone else's backyard, and he does not soften it or reframe it or tell a story about it that makes it easier to carry. He says, "This is what happened, this is what we are now, this is where we live." It is brutal. It is also the most honest accounting of the situation available. The evil paradox is that Rick's genuine moral failures exist alongside genuine moral insight in a way that is not resolvable through simple categorization. He has done evil things. He has also seen through evil systems with a clarity that most people, including most good people, cannot match. He is not good. He is also not simply or entirely bad. He is something that defies the categories. A person who is capable of understanding what goodness requires and who frequently, for comprehensible reasons, does not do it. Not because he cannot, because he is afraid, or damaged, or exhausted, or armored in ways that prevent goodness from getting through without costing him something the armor is protecting. There is something the show says quietly about Rick's moral position through the comparison the Citadel makes of him to his alternate selves. Rick C-137 sits roughly in the middle of the ethical distribution of Ricks. There are Ricks who are considerably worse. There are Ricks who are better. He is not the extreme version in either direction. He is complicated in the way that the character of a real person is complicated, where neither the good nor the bad is a performance, and neither tells the whole story. He is not evil. He is not good. He is what happens when enormous capacity for both exists in a person who has been badly damaged and who has decided, as a result of the damage, not to invest fully enough in either direction to be genuinely vulnerable to the consequences. Section 10. The Connection Paradox. Rick Sanchez does not want to be close to anyone. This is the stated position. He has built his entire personality around maintaining a specific and deliberate distance from genuine intimacy. He has perfected the exit, the deflection, the joke time to awry. Section 12. The Genius Curse Paradox. There is a concept in psychology that Rick Sanchez would probably already know the name of, because Rick Sanchez knows the name of most things. It is called depressive realism, and it describes a pattern that researchers have observed in people living with mild to moderate depression. The pattern is this: people with depression often have a more accurate assessment of reality than people without it. Not in every domain, not across all possible measures, but in specific and important ways. They are more accurate about how much control they have over situations. They are more accurate about how other people perceive them. They are more calibrated in general to the actual shape of reality because the optimistic illusions that most people carry, the gentle, self-protective distortions that make life feel manageable, have been stripped away. Most people, when asked whether they have above-average driving skills, say yes. Statistically, this is impossible, but the illusion is widespread because it is comfortable and it costs nothing in ordinary circumstances. Most people believe that good things are more likely to happen to them than to the average person, that they are slightly more capable than they actually are, that the world is somewhat more fair than it actually is. These are not lies. They are biological adaptations. They are the cognitive version of a pain threshold, the mechanism that keeps the weight of reality from becoming too heavy to carry. Rick does not have these illusions. He lost them somewhere in the process of becoming the person he is. His intelligence stripped them away, one by one, with the same systematic precision that it strips away every other comfortable fiction. He sees the actual odds. He sees the actual distribution of outcomes. He sees the actual mechanisms behind the things people call fate or luck or the universe working out. He sees all of it, and he sees it clearly, and what he sees is not comforting. What he sees is a universe that does not care, that runs on processes that have no preference for human well-being, that produces both joy and devastation with equal indifference, that does not moderate its pressure on any particular person regardless of what that person deserves. The genius curse paradox is this: the very thing that makes Rick extraordinary is the thing that makes ordinary life almost impossible for him. His intelligence, which gives him the power to do anything, also gives him the knowledge that undermines the comfort that makes anything worth doing. He cannot believe the optimistic illusions because he can see through them. He cannot rest in the stories people tell themselves about meaning and specialness and the universe caring about outcomes because he has looked at the actual structure of the universe and knows those stories are stories. He cannot make himself not know what he knows. The knowledge is irreversible. There is no unlearning what a mind like Rick's has learned. This is why he drinks. The drinking has always been framed as a character trait, the signature prop of the mad scientist genius, and it is that. But when you look at what the drinking is doing, when you look at what function it serves in Rick's psychology, it becomes something considerably more sad and more specific. The alcohol is an attempt to turn the volume down on a mind that never stops running, never stops analyzing, never stops seeing clearly enough to be uncomfortable with what it sees. A mind at Rick's level of operation is not quiet. It is never quiet. It runs continuously, at full capacity, taking in information and processing it and drawing conclusions and seeing implications, and following chains of causation to places most people will never reach. That is the mind that is trying to get through a day. That is the mind that is trying to be at a family dinner or watch something ordinary or sleep. The alcohol is the chemical equivalent of closing your eyes when the light is too bright. It dulls the precision just enough to make the ordinary survivable. And this produces its own paradox. Because Rick needs his intelligence. His intelligence is the source of everything that makes him valuable and capable and safe. He needs it sharp, he needs it operational, but living with it fully operational, without relief, is more than he can sustain. And so he drinks to dull the edge he depends on to stay alive. And then he needs the edge again when danger arrives, and he swings between these two states with the exhausted expertise of someone who has been making this trade-off for decades and has never found a better solution. The genius-curse paradox is also about isolation in a specific and almost ironic way. Rick's intelligence places him in a category of one. There is no one else who thinks the way he does, at the speed he does, with the precision and range he does. This means there is no one he can talk to honestly, no one for whom the full, unfiltered output of his mind would be comprehensible and welcome, no one he can simply be around without managing the gap between what he actually thinks and what the other person can receive. Even other Ricks, who share his fundamental cognitive architecture, are rivals rather than confidants. The citadel of Ricks is not a community of equals sharing their understanding. It is a room full of people who are the same kind of alone. Rick is, in the most literal possible sense, the only person in any room he enters who sees the room the way he sees it. And the way he sees it is often devastating and often accurate and always solitary. The intelligence that should give him the greatest possible access to the world instead gives him access to a version of the world that nobody else inhabits. He lives in a reality that is more true and more bearable for almost no one except someone with his specific kind of damage. He knows too much to be comforted and too much to be understood. He is, in the most profound possible way, alone in his own intelligence. And the only relief from that loneliness, the only moments when the isolation lifts even slightly, are the moments with people he loves. With Morty, who is not his intellectual equal but who is something more important, which is genuinely present, genuinely affected, genuinely there. With Beth, who carries his intelligence in a form that is different from his own and who understands things about him that she could not articulate but that she demonstrates in how she loves him. With the family, imperfect and complicated and often frustrating, who provide the one thing intelligence cannot produce on its own, the feeling of being known. The genius curse is real. And the paradox at its center is that the thing that makes Rick capable of anything is also the thing that costs him everything. The intelligence that was supposed to be his power turns out to be his deepest vulnerability. And the only relief from it is the very human, very ordinary, very specific connection with the very specific people who are not impressed by it. Section 13, The Revenge Paradox. Rick Sanchez killed Rick Prime. This is not the ending of a story. It is, paradoxically, the revelation of a paradox so large and so devastating that it reverberates through everything else the show has ever told us about Rick's psychology. He spent decades hunting Rick Prime. He organized his existence around the hunt. Every major decision of his adult life was made with reference to it, either directly advancing the search or structured around it in some other way. The construction of the Citadel was partly about the resources the hunt required. The choice to settle into a new dimension and a new family was partly about setting up a stable base while the hunt continued. The adventures with Morty, the day-to-day business of the show we have been watching, all of it happened in the foreground of a background that was always the hunt. Rick Prime was always there, in the corner of Rick's eye, the thing he was moving toward. And then he got there. He found Rick Prime. With Evil Morty's unexpected assistance, he tracked him down and had the confrontation that had been building for decades, and he won. He did what he set out to do. He got his revenge, and then he had to live with it being over. This is the revenge paradox. The thing that organized your existence for decades is not actually the thing you wanted. It was the structure around the thing you wanted. What Rick wanted was Diane back. What Rick wanted was the specific, ordinary life in the specific garage with the specific woman who chose to stay with a man whose mind was too large and too strange to be comfortable to be around, who stayed anyway because she understood him in the way some people understand difficult things, completely and without flinching. That is what he wanted, And that is what Rick Prime took from him in a way that the Omega device made permanently irreversible. The revenge was never going to get him what he wanted. He knew this. He is too intelligent not to have known it. The hunt was not a means to an end because the end was not achievable. The hunt was the point of the hunt. The motion was the thing, the forward momentum of having something specific and consequential to move toward, because the alternative to moving toward Rick Prime was sitting still with the full weight of a loss that had no remedy and no end. The revenge was Rick's way of making the grief into something with direction. Instead of grief with nowhere to go, he had grief aimed at a target. Instead of loss that was simply loss, he had loss that was the necessary precondition for justice. The hunt turned the intolerable into the organizing principle of a life. When the hunt was over, the organizing principle was gone. And what was left was the grief. Undiluted now by purpose, standing in the aftermath of the thing that had held it at a manageable angle for so long. The revenge paradox is that the thing Rick built his life around was a container for grief rather than a solution to it. And when the container is removed, the grief is still there, waiting, exactly the size it always was, unchanged by the decades of pursuit. This is also one of the most honest things the show has ever said about revenge. It does not offer the simple reading, the one where justice produces closure. It offers instead the complicated reading, the one where justice produces the silence that was always waiting on the other side of the injustice. The silence is not peace. It is just the absence of the noise that was covering something else. And what was being covered was always there. Rick will carry Diane forever, not because he could not find Rick Prime, but because he found him and killed him and the carrying did not stop. The love that created the grief is the thing that makes it permanent. You cannot grieve something you did not love. And Rick loved Diane in the specific, total, non-negotiable way that makes the grief permanent and the revenge inadequate. Not because revenge is wrong, but because love is larger than revenge can reach. Because the thing that was taken is irretrievable, regardless of what happens to the person who took it. The revenge paradox is the most complete form of the show's central argument about Rick. He organized his life around a goal that would not accomplish what he needed. He achieved the goal with extraordinary persistence and intelligence and pain. And the achievement revealed what the goal was covering. He is exactly where he has always been. In love with someone who is gone. In a universe that has no room for that love to land. Section 14. The Acceptance Paradox. Across the show's run, there are moments where Rick does something that the show frames as growth. Quiet moments, usually. Not announced with dramatic music or obvious narrative signposting. Rick says something real. Rick lets something through. Rick stays in the room when his instinct is to leave, or stays in the conversation when his instinct is to deflect, or does the vulnerable thing without immediately undoing it with a joke. These moments exist. They are real, and they are followed almost always by Rick going right back to the armor. Rick cannot fully accept what happened to him. He cannot accept Diane's death in the way that would allow him to grieve it completely and integrate it into a life that continued. He cannot accept the shape of the life he has now, the impersonation of a family that became a real family, the dimension that was not originally his that became his in every way that matters. He holds these things at arm's length, even while depending on them completely. He is a man in a house that is his who has not yet let himself believe it is his. The acceptance paradox is that Rick cannot accept the good without accepting the bad, and he cannot accept the bad because the bad is too large. The bad is Diane's death, permanent and unanswerable. The bad is the choice he made and what it cost. The bad is the decades of running and burning and being the person you become when you decide that protecting yourself from loss is more important than being present in the life you have. He cannot accept all of that because accepting it would require something he has not yet managed, which is the specific and terrifying act of letting what happened have happened, of saying, this is what occurred. This is the shape of my life. This is the cost, and the cost is real, and I am still here in the life that the cost bought. He cannot do that yet. Maybe he is edging toward it. The show gives glimpses of it, moments where Rick is in the vicinity of something like self-acceptance, something like integration, something like the peace that does not require everything to be resolved, but simply requires the person to be present in the unresolved thing. In the episode where Rick stands at the door of his old house in Dimension C-137, where the AI version of Diane calls to him from another room, and he makes the decision not to go in, not to try to see her again, not to reach for the simulation of what is gone. That moment is Rick at the closest he has come to acceptance. Not joy, not resolution, but the specific, quiet, costly act of turning away from what cannot be recovered and turning toward what is still there. He turned away. He did not fall apart. He kept going. That is not nothing. For Rick, it is enormous. The acceptance paradox is that Rick is the person in the show most in need of acceptance and the person most structurally prevented from it. His intelligence sees too clearly the weight of what he has done and failed to do. His grief is too specific to be dissolved. His pride is too complete to permit the admission of how much he has been hurt. And yet, the moments of near acceptance keep coming. They are small and they are quiet and they are followed by retreat, but they keep coming. He keeps almost arriving at the thing he needs. And in the logic of someone who has been running as long as Rick has, almost arriving is already extraordinary. Section 15. The Intelligence and Empathy Paradox. One of the things the show is most interested in is the question of whether intelligence and wisdom are the same thing. They are not, and Rick is the proof. Rick's intelligence is astronomical. His wisdom is, at times, genuinely terrible. He knows how to solve almost any problem the universe presents. He routinely fails to solve the simplest human problems. He can calculate the trajectory of a weapon across infinite dimensions and cannot calculate the cost of a casual cruelty to someone who loves him. He can see 14 moves ahead in any strategic situation and cannot see one move ahead in the emotional situations that matter most to the people around him. This is not a simple irony. It is something that the show takes seriously as a genuine human problem. Intelligence and empathy are not the same faculty. They are not even particularly well correlated. The ability to understand systems, to model complex processes, to predict outcomes and manipulate variables, does not translate automatically or reliably into the ability to feel what another person is feeling and respond appropriately. Some people have both. Some people have neither. And some people, like Rick, have intelligence in such excess and empathy in such intermittent and inconsistent supply that the gap between the two is one of the most defining things about them. Rick has empathy. This is important to say clearly, because the show is sometimes read as suggesting he does not. He has empathy in the specific, inconsistent, sometimes overwhelming, and sometimes completely absent way that people have it when it is connected to love. He feels what Morty feels when Morty is suffering in ways that matter to him. He is moved by Beth's pain in ways he cannot entirely suppress. He responded to Bird Person's death in ways that made clear that the capacity for something like grief on behalf of another person is real and present in him. His empathy is not absent. It is intermittent and selective and buried under armor and not available on demand. But it is there. The intelligence and empathy paradox is that Rick's intelligence sometimes works against his empathy rather than in support of it. A person with Rick's cognitive capacity can construct, with enormous precision, explanations for why any given emotional response is irrational. They can model the neurochemical processes involved, can identify the evolutionary origins of the feeling, can demonstrate logically why the feeling does not constitute valid evidence about reality. They can intellectualize their way away from the feeling before the feeling has had a chance to inform their behavior. This is not dishonesty. It is a kind of cognitive speed that outruns the emotional processing. The intellect arrives at the conclusion before the emotion has been fully registered, and the conclusion preempts the emotion rather than incorporating it. Rick does this constantly. He knows intellectually when someone near him is suffering. He models the suffering with precision, and then he constructs an explanation for why the suffering does not require a response, or why the response he is equipped to give would be counterproductive, or why the situation does not in fact qualify as the kind of emergency it appears to be. He intellectualizes past the moment where simple presence and simple acknowledgement would have been enough. He uses his intelligence to explain to himself why he does not need to do the human thing, when the human thing would take 10 seconds and would matter enormously. The people around him pay the cost of this. Morty especially, but all of them. The pattern is visible across seasons. Rick sees what is needed, constructs a reason not to provide it, and the relationship carries the scar of the withholding, over and over. Not from cruelty, not from indifference, but from a specific kind of intelligence-driven avoidance that is both comprehensible and genuinely damaging. What makes this a paradox rather than just a character flaw is that Rick's intelligence is also capable of producing moments of extraordinary empathy. When he breaks through the intellectualization, When the armor fails or the situation is too urgent to allow the construction of an explanation, what comes through is empathy that is specific and accurate and deeply felt. He knows Morty. He knows what Morty is afraid of, and what Morty needs, and what Morty carries. He knows Beth in the specific way that comes from long observation and real care. The knowledge is not abstract, it is intimate. And in the moments when he lets that knowledge produce action, when the intelligence is in service of the empathy rather than ahead of it, the results are the moments the show is most beautiful. He has the capacity. The paradox is that the very intelligence that gives him the capacity is also what gets in the way of it. Section 16. The home paradox? There is a question buried deep in the show that almost never gets asked directly, but that runs underneath everything like a foundation. What is home to Rick Sanchez? He was born in Dimension C-137. He lived there with Diane and Beth until a bomb came through a portal and changed everything. He has not been back to live there since. He spent decades after that loss in motion, moving between dimensions, in the spaces between places, not landing anywhere fully because landing anywhere fully required something he was not able to give, which was the act of deciding that here was where he was. He helped build the Citadel and then abandoned it. He killed other Ricks and took their surrender and then moved on. He eventually did what the world calls settling, which was choosing the dimension where a version of Beth had survived and grown up and was living her own version of the life she was supposed to have, and he stepped into that life and became the Rick of it. He buried his predecessor. He met Morty. He built the lab in the garage. That is, by any reasonable measure, home. The place he keeps returning to, the place from which he adventures and to which he comes back, the family that is organized around his presence even when his presence is difficult, the garage that is recognizably his in the way that spaces become recognizable as belonging to the people who inhabit them most fully. By every behavioral metric, the Smith house is home, and Rick has never quite let himself believe it. The home paradox is that Rick is living in the only home available to him while maintaining, in some deep and persistent part of himself, the psychological position of a man who is still between places. He has not fully landed. He cannot, because fully landing would require accepting that the home he is in is the home he has, that the family around him is the family he belongs to, that the dimension he is in is the dimension where his life is happening. And that acceptance requires a level of closure on the original loss that he has not reached, because the home he had, the original one, with Diane in it, was taken from him before he was done with it. And the part of him that is still in that moment, still in the garage on the day the bomb came through, has not yet given permission to call anywhere else home. This is one of the saddest things about Rick, and one of the most invisible. He is surrounded by home and living like a man who is still looking for it. He is in the presence of people who love him and who he loves, in a space that has been shaped by his presence for years, in a life that would be incomprehensible without him, and he moves through it with the slightly detached air of someone who is not sure how long he will be staying. Not because he plans to leave, because he has not yet told himself that he is allowed to stay. The home paradox also has a dimension in the show's mythology that is easy to miss. Rick Prime was, in a very real sense, trying to show Rick what was on the other side of home. He was offering Rick the life of a man without a home, the life of infinite motion and infinite freedom and infinite possibility. And Rick said no. He chose home. He chose the bounded life. And then the bounded life was destroyed, and Rick was left with the freedom he refused, living it against his will, and moving through it for decades trying to reconstruct the thing he had said yes to. The adventures with Morty are, in their way, the most elaborated attempt to rebuild home that the show contains. Not a house, not a dimension, the feeling of being with someone you choose, of being in a relationship that is specifically yours, of being known in the particular way that only comes with time and shared experience. Rick keeps going on adventures with Morty, not only for the reasons he states, but because the adventures are the closest thing he has found to the feeling of being where he belongs. Not because danger is home, because Morty is beginning to be home. He said no to the infinite. He chose the particular, and then the particular was taken. And now he is moving through the infinite, every day, collecting particulars to hold on to. He is coming home, slowly. In the way that people come home after very long absences, when the journey back takes longer than the journey out, he is not there yet. But he keeps moving in that direction. And the direction is unmistakable. Section 17. The time paradox and regret. There is something Rick Sanchez never talks about that is present in almost every scene he is in. It is the particular quality of regret that belongs to a man who knows exactly how things could have gone differently. Not vague regret, not the soft sadness of things that might have been. Precise, technical, detailed regret. The kind that comes from having the intelligence to reconstruct the exact moments where different choices would have produced different outcomes. The kind that does not allow the consolation of not knowing. He always knows. He always knows what he could have done differently, what he should have done differently, what he would do differently if differently were available to him. And differently is never available. The multiverse contains infinite other versions of events, but this version has only one direction, which is forward, and forward is away from everything he would go back to if going back were possible. This is a specific and underappreciated form of suffering. Most people are protected from the full weight of regret by uncertainty. They do not know with certainty that if they had made a different choice, the outcome would have been better. The uncertainty blunts the edge of it. You can always tell yourself it might have gone wrong the other way too, that the road not taken had its own complications, that there is no way to know. Rick does not have that protection. Rick can model the counterfactuals with extraordinary precision. He knows, better than a person without his intelligence ever could, what the alternative would have looked like. And knowing it with that kind of clarity, while being unable to access it, is a particular form of hell. The time paradox is that Rick has the power to do almost anything with time and matter and the structure of physical reality, and yet he cannot undo the thing he most needs to undo. He can travel between dimensions, but he cannot travel backward in time in any meaningful way that changes his specific situation. He can build technologies that reshape the universe, and he cannot reshape the one moment that matters most to him, which is the moment before the bomb came through the portal. He can save the day in 100 different configurations, and he cannot save the 2 specific people whose loss has defined his life. He has the tool for everything except the tool for the one thing. This is not just tragic. It is the show's most precise statement about the limits of power. Power, even extraordinary power, even the power of the smartest being in the multiverse, is not the same as the power to undo loss. The things that are truly gone are gone even for Rick Sanchez. He is not an exception to the laws that govern the most important things. He can circumvent physics. He cannot circumvent grief. He can solve every problem that has a solution. He cannot solve the ones that do not. And he knows this. He knows it with the clarity of someone who has tried to find the workaround and confirmed, through his own investigations, that there is none. The Omega device made sure of that. Diane is not accessible anywhere in the multiverse. The counterfactual where she lived is not a dimension he can step into. He is not being held back from it by ignorance. He has confirmed its absence. There is no door. There is only the wall. The time paradox, then, is about what you do when you have all the power in the universe and none of the power that matters. What you do when the thing you most need is the one thing that is specifically beyond your reach. Rick's answer has been, everything else. Do everything else. Keep moving, keep building, keep the adventures coming and the portal gun charged and the mind engaged with the next problem and the problem after that. Create the illusion of forward motion so complete that the wall at the back of it, the permanent and specific wall that is Diane's absence, is always just out of peripheral vision. Keep your eyes on what is ahead. Do not look at what you cannot reach. It is not a solution, but it is what he has, and he has lived inside it for decades, imperfectly and at great cost to himself and the people around him, with the kind of exhausted competence that belongs to people who have been doing the impossible thing, the thing that is not supposed to be survivable, for long enough that surviving it is just what they do now. He keeps going, not because he is okay, because he has decided to. And for Rick Sanchez, the decision to keep going, made every morning, in the face of everything that argues against it, is the most heroic thing the show has ever depicted. Final reflection: what the paradoxes add up to. We have come through a great many paradoxes tonight. Some of them structural, some of them psychological, some of them philosophical, all of them true. We have looked at Rick Sanchez from enough different angles that by now the shape of him should be visible not as a simple figure but as a complex one. The way a sculpture is complex when you walk around it and see that it looks different from every direction but coherent from all of them. What do all of these paradoxes add up to? They add up to a man who is more than his philosophy, more than his achievements, more than his failures, more than his grief. They add up to someone who contains everything the show has put in him, and who remains, despite the weight of that containment, stubbornly and specifically himself. The paradoxes are not bugs, they are features. They are evidence of depth. A character without contradictions is a character without interiority. The contradictions in Rick are the evidence that he is real in the way that matters, which is that he cannot be reduced to a single thing. He cannot be summarized. He cannot be categorized and put away. Every time you think you have the measure of him, another dimension opens. Another paradox surfaces. Another place where the internal logic reaches its own limit, and he steps off it anyway. Rick Sanchez is the show's argument that people are worth more than their worst moments and more than their best. That the person who has done terrible things is not only the terrible things. That the person who loves imperfectly is not only the imperfection. That the person who builds walls against the people they love is also the person who keeps coming back to stand outside those walls, waiting for a way in, waiting for the moment when the armor is light enough to remove. He is the man who chose love in the garage and has been choosing it, imperfectly and incompletely and without ever quite saying so, every day since. He chose it when he said no to Rick Prime. He chose it when he settled into a dimension that was not originally his, because being near something like a family was better than the alternative. He chooses it when he comes back from the adventures instead of disappearing into the multiverse permanently. He chooses it when he lets Morty in, just far enough, just enough to let something real pass between them. He chooses it constantly, in the ways available to someone who is as damaged as he is, which are the quiet ways, the indirect ways, the ways that could be denied if necessary. He never stops choosing it. That is the final paradox and the final answer. A man who says nothing matters, choosing, every day, the people who do. Sleep well tonight. The paradoxes will still be here when you wake up. So will Rick Sanchez in some dimension or another, choosing the family one more time, grumbling about it, portal gun in hand, never quite leaving. That is the most human thing I have ever seen in a cartoon about a drunk scientist and his nervous grandson. Until next time, wherever you are in the world tonight, sleep well. Bonus reflection. Living inside the contradiction. There is one more thing worth saying before the quiet settles in completely. One more angle on Rick Sanchez that does not quite fit into any single category but belongs to all of them. It is about what it means to watch a character live inside contradictions without resolution, and why that watching feels so specifically real. Most stories, if you look at them honestly, are comfort machines. They take a person with contradictions, and they move that person toward resolution. The contradictions reduce. The character changes. The growth arc arrives at a place where the most painful gaps between who a person is and who they want to be have been narrowed to something livable. This is satisfying. It is supposed to be satisfying. It gives the audience the feeling of progress, of movement, of the universe rewarding effort with coherence. This is why people who carry their own versions of Rick's paradoxes, their own versions of the armor and the grief and the intelligence that works against them and the love that they cannot quite let themselves show, feel seen by this show in a way that they sometimes do not feel seen by stories that resolve more neatly. Not because they want to be stuck, not because they think staying stuck is correct or admirable or something to celebrate, but because being seen accurately is its own form of comfort. Being told, yes, this is complicated, yes, it does not resolve quickly, yes, the person inside the armor is still there and still real and still worth caring about, this is a thing that matters. Rick Sanchez is the most thorough fictional accounting of a specific kind of human experience that I know of. The experience of carrying enormous capacity alongside enormous damage. Of being capable of everything and unable to do the simplest things. Of loving people so completely that the love frightens you and so you hold it sideways, at an angle, in forms that are deniable and indirect and that the people you love can feel but cannot quite name. Of building a philosophy around the idea that nothing matters because the thing that mattered most was taken, and carrying both the philosophy and the grief simultaneously, forever, unable to resolve either. He is not a hero. He is not a villain. He is not a role model, and the show is clear that he is not supposed to be one. He is a person. A broken, brilliant, grieving, armored, loving, avoidant, extraordinary, ordinary person whose extraordinary and ordinary qualities are so thoroughly intertwined that you cannot take one without the other. And that, perhaps, is the deepest thing the show has to say. Not about nihilism, not about the multiverse, not about the nature of intelligence or love or free will or identity. The deepest thing it says is simply this: people are more than their worst qualities and more than their best. They are the whole complicated system. They are the contradictions held in tension. They are the grief and the love and the armor and the moments when the armor fails. They are the choosing and the running and the coming back. They are the portal gun and the garage, and the family they never quite said yes to out loud but kept returning to because yes was always there, underneath the no, underneath the philosophy, underneath the brilliant, exhausted, irreplaceable performance of not caring. Rick Sanchez says nothing matters. He lives like love is the only thing that does. Both of those things are true at the same time, and in between them is where everything worth watching lives. Until next time, sleep well, wherever you are. Extended reflection. The bottle and the brain. Alcohol as the final paradox. There is one more paradox that has been present in every section of this script without being named directly. It is in the background of every other paradox, the way a low sound is present in a room without being the thing you are listening to. It is the bottle, the flask, the constant, ever-present liquid companionship that Rick carries through every adventure, every crisis, every family dinner, every quiet moment in the garage when the rest of the house is asleep. Rick drinks. This is one of the most constant facts of his characterization. It is one of the first things you notice about him and one of the things that never goes away. He drinks in the spaceship. He drinks while building things. He drinks while in combat. He drinks before difficult conversations and during them and after them, if the conversations happen at all. He drinks in the way that people drink when the drinking has become structural, when it is no longer a choice made in particular circumstances but a constant that the rest of life is arranged around. The alcohol paradox is this. Rick uses the thing that dulls his greatest asset to cope with the cost of having that greatest asset. He drinks to quiet the mind that he needs to stay alive. He uses a depressant to manage the condition of being the most extraordinary mind in the multiverse, which is a condition that turns out to require management. The intelligence is not comfortable. It is not, in itself, a pleasant experience. It is the experience of being unable to not see things clearly, of being unable to rest in comfortable simplifications, of having every easy consolation revealed as insufficient and every simple answer revealed as incomplete. Living inside that mind is like living inside a room with no dark corners. There is nowhere to rest your eyes. There is nowhere the light does not reach. And the alcohol is Rick's way of creating shadow. Temporary, chemical, ultimately inadequate shadow. But shadow. The specific paradox within the alcohol paradox is one of the most quietly devastating things about Rick's characterization. His drinking is both the most human thing about him and the thing that most consistently costs him the humanity he is trying to preserve. He drinks to numb the isolation that comes from being the most intelligent person in any room. The drinking makes the isolation worse because it creates a version of Rick that is less accessible, less present, less capable of the genuine connection that might actually address the isolation. It is a solution that metabolizes into the problem it was meant to solve. And he knows this. This is the part that makes it a paradox rather than just a tragedy. A person of Rick's intelligence understands the pharmacology of what he is doing to himself. He understands with perfect clarity the way alcohol interacts with the neural architecture he depends on. He knows the cycle. He has, in all likelihood, modeled it the way he models everything else, laid it out in his mind like an equation, seen exactly what it costs and what it provides and what the long-term trajectory looks like. And he drinks anyway. Because knowing is not the same as being able to stop. Because understanding a problem fully is not the same as having a solution to it. Because sometimes the thing you know is bad for you is the only thing that makes the present moment survivable. And Rick has been making the present moment survivable, one drink at a time, for decades. Not because he has given up, because he has not yet found the thing that would make the surviving feel like more than surviving. The alcohol is also, in the show's vocabulary, a signal. Every time you see Rick reach for the flask in a quiet moment, you are seeing the gap between what he presents and what he is. You are seeing the pressure of everything he carries, expressed in the one gesture that requires the least vulnerability. It is the cheapest available relief, and he takes it, not because he has no dignity, but because dignity is expensive when you are carrying as much as he carries, and the bills come due all the time, and the flask is always within reach. There is a version of this story where Rick gets sober and becomes someone different, and the something different is better. The show does not tell that story, and I suspect it does not tell it because it is not the most honest story to tell. The most honest story is the one where the drinking is not solved, but is instead understood, where we stop treating it as a simple character flaw and start treating it as what it actually is, which is a record of everything Rick has been through and everything he has not yet been able to set down. The drinking is the weight made visible. It is the proof that carrying all of it costs something real, every day, without interruption. He is not weak for it. He is tired. And there is a very large difference between those two things. The bottle and the brain, the genius and the self-medication, the most extraordinary mind in the multiverse, and the flask that makes living inside it bearable. This is the final paradox. The last one. The one that holds all the others in solution. That is present in every scene. That is the constant in all the variables. He drinks because he is brilliant. He is brilliant and he is in pain. He is in pain because he loved someone and she was taken. He loved her because he was, before any of the armor, before any of the philosophy, before any of the multiverse adventures and the revenge and the nihilism and the portal gun, simply a man. A man in a garage. A man who said yes to the ordinary, who chose the particular over the infinite, who made the most human choice possible and has been paying for it and honoring it and refusing to entirely abandon it for the rest of his life. He chose love. Everything else, every paradox, every contradiction, every gap between what he says and what he does, every imperfect and costly and irreducibly himself thing about him flows from that one original yes. He said yes to Diane. He has been saying yes, in the only ways available to him ever since. That is Rick Sanchez. That is the man inside all the paradoxes. That is what you are watching when you watch the show. That is what makes it worth watching. Not the science fiction, though the science fiction is extraordinary. Not the comedy, though the comedy is some of the best available. But this, the man inside the armor, the yes underneath the no, the love underneath the nihilism, the home underneath the running. He is trying. In the specific, inadequate, costly, real way that people try when the trying is hard and the progress is slow and the outcome is uncertain. He is trying. And so are you. And so am I. Good night. A final word on paradoxes and people. Paradoxes are not failures of logic. They are not mistakes in the design of a thing. A paradox is what you have when reality is more complex than any single framework can contain. When the truth about something requires two contradictory statements held simultaneously, when collapsing, the contradiction would make the description less accurate rather than more. The contradiction is the information. The paradox is the map of something real. Every person you have ever known, if you have known them long enough and closely enough, is a paradox. They hold contradictory things at once. They believe things that are in tension with their behavior. They love in ways that cost the people they love something. They run from the things they most need. They return to the things they have run from. They are brave in some configurations and cowardly in others. They are honest and dishonest, generous and selfish, wise and foolish. Sometimes in the same afternoon, sometimes in the same conversation. They are the whole complicated system, not the simplified version. And the simplified version was never quite true. Rick Sanchez is a paradox because the people who made him were paying close attention to what people actually are. They were not drawing a symbol or a statement or a lesson. They were drawing a person. And people are paradoxes, the most interesting ones most of all. When you watch Rick Sanchez and feel the specific, slightly unsettling pleasure of watching someone who makes no sense make perfect sense, you are feeling the pleasure of recognition. You are recognizing something true about the shape of experience. You are seeing yourself, in some dimension, in some version, in the specific and irreducible complexity of a person who loves too much to say so and runs too fast to escape and comes back too consistently to be pretending not to care. That recognition is what keeps people coming back to this show. Not the science fiction, though it is extraordinary. Not the comedy, though it is some of the finest in the medium. The recognition, the feeling of being seen accurately, the feeling that someone, somewhere, understood the paradox and was honest about it. Rick Sanchez is a gift. Broken, imperfect, self-contradictory, sometimes terrible, always unmistakably real. A gift. From the people who made him, to everyone who has ever sat with their own contradictions in the dark and wondered whether the contradictions mean something is wrong with them, or whether the contradictions are simply the evidence of being thoroughly, irrevocably, inescapably alive. They are the evidence of being alive. You are not broken because you contain contradictions. You are alive because you do. Good night. On watching and being watched. One last small thing before silence. There is a reason these long, slow videos about fictional characters work late at night. It is not because the characters are unimportant or the analysis is trivial. It is because the late-night mind is the most honest mind. When the day is over and the performance of the day is done, and you are lying somewhere soft with the darkness around you and nothing immediately required of you, the usual filters lower. The usual distance between you and the things you actually feel shortens. You are closer to yourself than you are at 2 in the afternoon, when you are upright and purposeful and protected by the business of moving through the world. And in that closer state, a character like Rick Sanchez lands differently. He is not just an entertaining figure in an animated show. He is a mirror. He shows you something about the specific kind of strength it takes to keep going when the thing you most needed has been taken. The specific kind of courage it takes to keep showing up for people when showing up is expensive. The specific kind of love that looks like distance because the person doing the loving has learned, through the hardest available lesson, that loving without armor is how you get destroyed. You recognize this because you have your own version of it. We all do. The armor is different for everyone. The thing it is protecting is different. The cost of the protection is different. But the structure is the same. And seeing it reflected back clearly, without judgment, without insistence that it be resolved before we can proceed, is something that matters in the specific way that being accurately seen always matters. You are not alone in your paradoxes. That is the last thing to take into sleep tonight. You are not alone in the contradiction of caring deeply about things you cannot control, of loving people imperfectly, of carrying grief that does not resolve neatly, of being braver than you look, and more afraid than you admit.